Hi, everybody. Okay, sorry, I was just getting situated on the stage. I was so confused how this worked, to be honest. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna figure out sharing my screen, and then we will officially get started. Okay, did that work for screen share? Mm. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, y'all. Yep, I fucked up. Okay. Let me do this again. Okay. Looks like y'all can see it now. Cool. I am now going to go to that screen so I can do the things. Um, I'm not going to be looking at the chat as I go since I'm looking at my slides. But I will hopefully have time for Q&A at the end for us to answer any questions and chat about stuff. So welcome to my panel. I'm super excited to be here with y'all. My panel is titled Nonhuman Identity, Gender, Autism, and Mental Health Results from My Dissertation. So I'm assuming many of y'all participated in my dissertation when I collected data, gosh, like a year and a half ago now. This has been a big project, a long time in the making. So I'm really excited to finally have it finished and be ready to share it with y'all. Um, so I am Nat, or Blood Muffins. I finally basically have my PhD. It'll be official in like a couple weeks, but that's why I have the approximately PhD here. I won't stop you from calling me doctor, but technically it's a couple weeks off. Um, I do want to give y'all a heads up that this is going to be a long presentation. Um, my dissertation was really big. I essentially did what could have been 3 dissertations as 1 dissertation, as my committee told me repeatedly when I did my defense. But I don't know, for me, what mattered was to just do, um, a study that felt like I could do everything I wanted to and give back to the community in the ways I wanted to. My committee was really like, "You did so much more than you needed to." But for me, it wasn't about checking the box of completing a dissertation to get my degree. For me, it was more like I went to grad school to be able to do this study, to be able to have a venue to do this kind of research. So, of course, I was going to make it as big and awesome as I could. So, here we are. It's gonna be long, that's why the panel's scheduled to be an hour and a half. I'm gonna try to finish in that time frame and have time for questions, but we'll see. Um, I do also just wanna give the disclaimer that I'm gonna be sharing data, and quotes from the qualitative part of the study as I go through this, so, I do just wanna give the disclaimer that if you recognize a quote of yours provided in the results, um, it's up to you if you want to identify yourself or not. Just please understand that if you do that, that's you choosing to void your confidentiality and privacy, and I'm not responsible for any like consequences of that decision. That's totally up to you. Um, so yeah, with that disclaimer stuff out of the way, let's dive in. So I'm gonna go over just some kind of theoretical framing for the study, specifically the minority stress framework and the study focus. I'm going to talk about what my research aims were, how I did the study, the results, and some implications of the results. But before getting into things, I just want to also orient you to who I am. So like I said, I'm Nat or Blood Buffins. I use they, them, or z's on pronouns. I'm a white, queer, non-binary, autistic, dingotherian. Fun fact, I just found out I'm autistic this past January, so that's been a new and exciting identity development for myself. um, to just align with the study in even more ways and find out so much about myself. I have been active in the non-human identity community since 2009, which earlier today I had the stark realization that that means I've been around for 15 years, and that's just like a weird sentence to say and acknowledge. Um, I've previously done other psychological research on non-human identity. I did my undergrad thesis, Life Stories of Therianthropes, and Analysis of Non-Human Identity in a Narrative Identity Model, which you can find for free online and which I presented at the first OtherCon, and that panel is up on the OtherCon's YouTube page if you're interested in checking that out. Like I said, I'm earning slash have now essentially earned my PhD in clinical psychology with an emphasis in LGBTQ psychology. I've done a lot of research and clinical work as a therapist, and I primarily focus on working with trans, non-binary, neurodivergent, and ultra-human communities through both my research and clinical work. I've provided a non-human identity 101 training for other therapists, and I'm really passionate about trying to increase knowledge about alter humanity within the field of mental health and the field of psychology. Um, some of my biggest just personal values that translate into my professional life are to be as non-pathologizing and non-stigmatizing as possible, um, and to really honor self-determination, self-identification. Autonomy is probably my biggest value in life, as well as neurodiversity and queerness. So all these values really shape the way I approach the study and my work in general. So I just want to name that for framing. And then I also wanted to acknowledge my positionality as an insider researcher with this particular research topic. So that means that I share the identities of the community that I was doing research for or about. And I think there can be a dominant narrative that if you're like too close to research that isn't good, that means it's biased somehow. But actually, there's been more and more recent research kind of highlighting that that's not necessarily the case, and it can actually be a really big asset to share identities with the research that you're doing. It can lead to greater authenticity and attunement and understanding than someone who's unfamiliar with those identities, which ultimately increases the fidelity of the research itself. So I just want to highlight that piece too. I absolutely think it was an asset that I, as someone with my identities, was doing this research because I could understand the things that I was asking about and the results that I was analyzing in a way that someone who's unfamiliar with our communities wouldn't have been able to. So my goals just for this presentation are to, of course, share my results back to y'all. Huge, huge thank you to everyone who participated. Excuse me, or otherwise supported this project. I really want to share the minority stress and resilience framework with y'all, and also just share what I shared in my dissertation defense. This presentation itself is only a pretty minorly edited version of the actual defense I did to my committee for my dissertation, and my kind of goal there is around being transparent in the way that I'm talking about these topics in the psychology field and in professional spaces and advocating for us. As well as I'm hoping to engage in dialogue about this study and non-human identity related research and mental health support in general. I'd love to hear from y'all, like what you think about what I did and what helpful and important next steps would be. So, starting off with just kind of framing the study and giving a bit of a theoretical background with the minority stress framework. So the minority stress and resilience model posits that minoritized individuals experience additional stressors that other people don't experience. So things like discrimination and rejection, and internalized negativity about their identities. And that on the flip side, resilience factors help to mitigate those stressors and promote well being. And it is that these stressors are the things that explain the mental health disparities that we tend to see in queer and autistic and other minoritized groups. So basically, back in the day, like the 90s ish, there was a lot of research coming out saying that, like, hey, gay people have worse mental health than other people. There must be something inherently wrong about being gay that causes these mental health disparities. Then Meyer in 2001 came along and was like, hey, shocking idea. What if it's not being gay that makes your mental health worse, but all the stressors associated with being gay, like dealing with homophobia and discrimination and identity concealment, that leads to those mental health disparities. And sure enough, when we do research from this lens, that ends up being accurate. And so after that point, that model has been introduced into queer research, and it has been expanded beyond LGB communities to gender minority communities, with the gender minority stress and resilience measure in 2015. And then most recently, it has been expanded to non-binary identities, specifically um, with the non-binary minority stress and resilience model, which, fun fact, I was on the research team for. That's another project that I've been working on the last 5 years with Dr. Matsuno, and obviously a group of other folks. We did interviews and focus groups with non-binary adults, asking them about their experiences of non-binary related minority stress and resilience, and use that to identify what those are. And it was through participating in that project that really inspired this dissertation because I just saw so many parallels between what folks were talking about as minority stressors related to their non-binary identities to what I've seen people talk about and share experiences about um, within the non-human communities. Whoop. Um, so just to make that a little bit more concrete, here is an image of the non-binary minority stress and resilience model. So in this model, stressors are broken up into distal and proximal stressors. That just means things that are outside of you and things that are internal to you. So distal things are things like discrimination, harassment, misgendering, invalidation, burdening, binary normativity. And then proximal stressors are the kind of corresponding internalized effects of those things. So internalized validation and negativity, concealment, dysphoria, etc. And then we also have interpersonal level and individual level resilience factors, things like community connectedness, validation, identity pride, gender euphoria. Um, so again, I hope that helps kind of clarify like what this model is, because this is kind of the framework I'm using for my study. So for this study, the minority stressors and resilience factors I zoned in on were concealment slash camouflaging and species dysphoria as the stressors, and identity pride, community connectedness, and prioritizing meaning for the resilience factors. In terms of the stressors, I was most interested, honestly, probably in species dysphoria, just because previous research, including my own, has shown that that's so common. As well as I have this graphic here of 3 community surveys that have shown that at least 75% of respondents typically endorse species dysphoria. So this is a super common thing and something that I think is really important for the mental health field to be aware of, to be able to support people with in therapy and clinical spaces. And then on resilience factor, things like identity, pride, community connectedness, prioritizing meaning was one that I proposed for this study. It means that like the more that you prioritize things that feel fulfilling and meaningful in your life, um, essentially research shows that the more you do that, the more like well-being and better mental health you tend to have. So I posited that that might be a particularly relevant resilience factor for our community because I feel like we do so much to prioritize the meaning that we find in our identities and making choices that affirm us. So that was something I wanted to look at in our community. Okay, so the research aims of the study. Um, the first one was to compare non-human and human identified participants, taking into account gender and autistic identities on all of these different variables. So basically, mental health variables: depression, anxiety, stress, well being, camouflaging, and prioritizing meaning. The second research aim was to create and test the psychometric properties of a measure of species dysphoria, the species dysphoria scale. Um, Fun fact, this was not initially in my dissertation proposal, which is like when I had to propose the study I was going to do. I actually left this out, made the scale entirely on my own without like telling my advisor that I was doing that. Because I was so confident I would be able to because of the experience I've had making scales with the non-binary minority stress study. And I just thought, "Hey, I'm just gonna throw this scale in here, and if it works out, great, I can use it. If it doesn't, cool, whatever. It wasn't part of the proposal anyway." Um, and spoiler alert, it worked out. So that was really exciting, and I got to just add this whole extra thing in here, which I feel really proud of, honestly. The third research aim was to test a model for non-human identity-related minority stress and resilience. So this is like a fancy structural equations modeling graphic, but all it means is these things on the left, camouflaging species dysphoria, prioritizing meaning, identity, pride, community connectedness. I'm testing to see if they will predict psychological distress as measured by depression, anxiety, and stress, and psychological well-being, as I would expect they would within the minority stress and resilience framework, right? Camouflaging and species dysphoria being stressors, the other three being those resilience factors. Um, and then the fourth research aim was the qualitative portion of the study. So I had a bunch of open-ended questions at the end of the survey asking participants about the relationship between their non-human identity and gender identity, the relationship between their non-human identity and autistic identity, stressors and resilience factors related to non-human identity, and sources of non-human identity related joy. And those stressors, resilience factors, and joy related questions were directly taken from things that we had asked folks in the non-binary minority stress and resilience project. Okay, so just some brief methodological stuff in terms of how I did this. Um, so I recruited both non-human and human identified adults. Folks had to be at least 18, living in the US and Canada, and have English proficiency and internet access to be able to take the English survey online. The age and location restrictions were due to IRB procedures and compensation. So participants were paid $10 in the form of either a Target or Amazon gift card, their choice. Um, and basically, when you do an academic study, it has to go through an ethics committee that has to review it and approve it. And to be able to offer compensation for folks around the world got really, really complicated with how strict my institution's IRB is. And so, unfortunately, that is why I had to limit it to just the US and Canada. And I'm really hopeful that in the future, I'll be able to think of creative ways to be able to still compensate and share that appreciation of folks' time in participating in research, but being able to recruit a wider amount of folks from around the world because we do have a worldwide community, and I do think it's really important that research reflects that. But for the sake of the dissertation, that's why it was limited to those countries. In terms of recruitment, I'm just gonna briefly talk about the process I went through because it was, honestly just really cool and fancier than what a lot of other studies do. So I did a sequential two-phase recruitment process where first I identified non-human folks in online community spaces, specifically forums and Discord groups. Um, and I just did open recruiting. I didn't have any kind of specifications about folks' identities or backgrounds. It was just if you identify as non-human, whatever that means for you, you're welcome to participate in the survey. Um, I guess barring, meeting those other inclusion criteria. Then after I closed recruitment for non-human folks, I analyzed that sample's demographics so that I could match the human identified participants on targeted demographics to create equivalent groups. And that's to ensure that there weren't other demographic factors that might be confounding the results that I found. So I matched the two groups on age group, white versus POC racial background, binary trans slash non-binary breakdown of gender, and autistic non-autistic proportions. Um, Note that I did not end up recruiting any cisgender human folks because there were simply so few of them amongst the non-humans that I actually had to drop the gender part of my previously stated planned analyses because there were literally like 20 cis people and maybe like 20 binary trans people for that matter. Like we are an overwhelmingly non-binary community, which I knew, but I still thought it was really funny that there were so few cis people. I had to just completely leave out cis humans altogether. So and then I recruited binary, trans, and non-binary folks to match the proportion in the non-human group. So I'm not gonna talk through this whole thing. This is basically just to show I had a total of 317 participants in the study, 182 non-human identified folks, 135 human identified folks. The thing that I think is really interesting here is that even when I recruited human identified folks, I actually got 11 non-human folks. So I did include the like, do you identify as non-human screener just across the board so that I was, sure what group people should actually be in. Um, and just doing regular old queer recruitment of like a general panel of folks, I still ended up with 11 non-human identified people, and I think this has really interesting implications that I will touch on closer to the end. In terms of demographics, like I said, I asked folks if they were non-human just by asking a straightforward question about it, and then if they answered yes, they were screened into all the non-human specific portions of the survey. I asked gender identity in a multi-question way, a write in, a select all, and then a select one format. The purpose of that being so that folks could share all of their different identities and experiences, but then also for the sake of being able to compare people on things, that they got to choose how they were being categorized. So anyone who selected multiple from the check all that apply box got a follow-up question basically saying, okay, but if you had to choose one, which one would you pick? Including an option to say there's no one particular identity I identify most strongly with. So they were able to still opt into that option. Um, and I did the same thing for sexual and romantic orientation. Again, in the interest of letting folks have agency over how they're being counted rather than me making assumptions. And then around autism, I asked about self identification and diagnosis status, and people were categorized as autistic if they answered yes to either question. So again, I was really centering self identification here. I just asked diagnosis status because I thought it was interesting as a follow up, basically, but I was more focused on self identification. Okay, let's talk about the results. First, I'm going to go through the demographics. There are a lot of demographics. This is the most comprehensive assessment of demographics of our community done to date, and I think it's really, really cool. I love looking at demographics. Honestly, like every time someone does like a community survey, I'm always like, "Oh my gosh, this is so cool." So, hope y'all will bear with me and also find it interesting. Um, I think it's really neat to get to just describe our community. So, first, looking at autism, this graph shows the percentage of participants in each subsample who were autistic based on each item. So we see about 60% of the non-human sample self-identified as autistic, and ultimately a little over 60% were categorized as autistic. Um, and that there were no significant differences between self-identity and ultimate categorization of autistic between the non-human and human folks. There was a significant difference, though, between those who said they've been formally diagnosed with autism between the two groups, with more non human identified folks endorsing an autism diagnosis than humans. Um, and I'm not even going to begin to speculate as to why that could be. Like, I certainly have some thoughts, but there's just so much that goes into accessibility to autism diagnoses that without following up about it, I really don't think we can make any conclusions about that, but I do think it was an interesting thing to find and note, and could be interesting to follow up on in future research. In terms of gender of sample, so there were no significant differences between non-binary and binary trans categorizations, which is good because remember that was something I was matching the groups on. That means I was successful on that. But you'll notice with these pie charts that the ultimate breakdown of gender identities is pretty different though, with way more human folks just labeling themselves as non-binary, versus much more variation in gender identities reported by the non-human sample. Still about a quarter saying non-binary, but many others identifying most strongly with like agender, genderqueer, xenogender, more than one, or other. There's quite a few more in the other category here than with the human folks. Um, Not surprising to me at all, but really cool to see that depicted graphically. In terms of the other matched demographics, there were no differences in terms of age or race ethnicity between the two samples. This was overall a young sample with the mean age of about 26 years old. It was also an overwhelmingly white sample, with 73% of the non-human sample identifying as white, and then two-thirds of the human sample identifying as white, trying to match that. This is actually not atypical for other trans samples recruited online. It's actually pretty typical. So I wouldn't say our community, or at least who I access for this uh study, is necessarily like more white than other queer and neurodivergent samples that are recruited online. But I do think it speaks to the need that we have just across the board in research to be doing a better job recruiting people of color into our surveys. In terms of sexual orientation, there were a couple differences between the non-human folks and the human folks. With significantly more non-human participants identifying as asexual and demisexual, and significantly more human folks identifying as lesbians. So the ace and demi stuff really didn't surprise me. I've definitely noticed a lot of aspec folks in our communities, and that came up at the panel this morning too. I didn't necessarily predict that humans would be more likely to be lesbians though, so, there you go, that's interesting. Um, and then we had a really similar trend with romantic orientation, with non-humans, more likely to identify as aromantic, demi-romantic, or other, and humans once again more likely to identify as lesbians for their romantic orientation. I also asked folks education level, the highest level of education they've received. There were no significant differences here. You can see that a lot of folks are in some amount of college. In fact, some college is the largest piece of both of these pies, as well as bachelor's degrees or associate's degrees. I think that makes a lot of sense given that the sample was relatively younger, like in their early mid 20s. So that tracks. I also asked folks about employment statuses. I did not actually examine the differences between the non-human and human groups here. It was a check all that apply item that I did not recategorize to run analyses on, because it just wasn't a big focus of my study. But I still just reported these here, and some of them are a little bit interesting. Like, for example, non-human folks were more likely to be employed full-time. And we're also more likely to report volunteering and report other for their employment status. Again, I don't know if those differences are statistically significant because I didn't test it, but just eyeballing these percentages, those are some of the trends that stood out to me. In terms of income, there were also no significant differences. Overall, people did not make a ton of money in terms of participants for this study, which is unfortunately not surprising given that most participants are queer and neurodivergent. We tend to be unemployed and underemployed. And there's, a whole lot of systemic issues there that I think is reflected in these numbers. So yeah, not a whole lot to comment on here. It was kind of disheartening to see, but unsurprising. And there were no differences between the non-human and human groups. I also asked folks about relationship status. This was also a check all that apply option. Um, that included single, dating one person, more than one person, committed relationship with one partner or more than one partner, married in a domestic partnership, civil union, or other. I didn't compare each individual line for these, but I did compare people saying they were single versus in any type of relationship, and that did have a significant difference with non-human folks more likely to be in a relationship of some kind, which I thought was really interesting and is kind of like a bookend to Paige's panel earlier about relationships and dating. Hopefully, it instills some hope on that front as well as the panel earlier hopefully did too. That actually a lot of us are in relationships and seem to be successful in that regard. I also asked about polyamorous and kink identities. I just asked both of these in dichotomous ways, so not a lot of nuance in this information. But I did find it amusing how different we were compared to the humans, with half of us identifying as polyamorous and over half reporting that they participate in kink, BDSM, or leather activities, and the humans having significantly fewer folks endorsing both identities, only a little over a quarter and nearly a third, respectively. So we are more poly and more kinky than the humans. Again, unsurprising, but just cool to see it reflected in the data like this. In terms of spiritual and religious affiliation, um, this was another check all that apply that I did not examine the differences for, but there are a few trends I find interesting to point out. The biggest ones being that non-human folks were way more likely to endorse pagan and my spiritual beliefs do not fit a formal religion options, while the human folks were much more likely to endorse agnostic and atheist as their um spiritual identities. So it would appear from this that our community tends to be more spiritually inclined than human folks, um, which I think makes a lot of sense. It would be really cool to follow up on and incorporate further into future research. And then finally, I did also ask everyone about their plural status. About 40% of the non-human participants identified as plural, which was significantly more than the not quite 4% of human folks who identified as such. So way more plurals in our community. And then there were additional non-human related demographics that folks who identified as non-human were given. So I'll share those as well. So folks were going to check all that apply list of non-human identity terms, asking people what words they used. You can see that otherkin, non-human, therian, and fictionkin were the most commonly endorsed, but they were all chosen by at least a few folks. I did want to acknowledge that it was only after I collected data and looked back at my survey that I realized I totally left out Phytanthrope and Endel, and I literally don't know why. So huge apology on that front. I meant to include them. I don't know how I missed that. And definitely in future research, I would want to add them. And perhaps other terms that have come out and kind of, been popularized since then as well. I also asked folks if they had any other alter human identities, most common being furry, followed by plural and other hearted. Some folks also endorsing heart home, a few real vampires, and a few folks who also said none. But overall, most folks did endorse some other kind of alter human identity alongside their non human identity. And then I also asked about number of kin types and asked people to write in their kin types if they wanted to. So in terms of number of kin types, the largest like single, proportion of this pie was one kin type, but like the majority of the pie overall is some amount of more than one kin type. And you see it kind of goes down with each number until you get to 10 or more, which jumps up again to 15%. Um, I suspect this may be, because of the way that, plural systems might have answered differently depending on, if they were answering for, like, themselves or for the system as a whole. I didn't have any guidance in the survey about, responding one way or the other, and different folks might have responded differently. So I think it makes sense that, like, bigger systems might have put 10 or more to kind of account for everybody. And I think that's probably why we see that trend there. In terms of category of kin types, not gonna lie, I struggled figuring out how to, like, categorize everything. It was so cool seeing everyone's, like, really specific identities that they wrote in. I do have a spreadsheet of all of them. And for the sake of this, presentation at least, I just included the biggest, categories, that, like, things fell under, so, like, animals, mythological creatures, fictional, etcetera. In the actual dissertation itself, it includes some more specifics. Um but yeah, so we see, most folks I included some kind of animal identity, followed by mythological, followed by fictional, and then there were a few machine/robot android folks, some concept kin, OC kin, object kin, aliens, and one mushroom. Shout out to the one mushroom. And then I also asked folks about the length of time they have identified as non-human, they were aware of the non-human communities, and that they have been participating in the non-human communities. So in general, folks were aware of their identities or have been identifying as non-human for the longest, with the biggest chunk of the pie being 15 or more years. Folks have been aware of the communities generally for a little bit less time, with the largest piece of the pie being 5 to 10 years. And then folks have been participating in the communities for even less time than that generally, with the largest chunk here being 2 to 5 years. And I think that makes sense, right? For a lot of people, these identities are things that they've been aware of their whole lives or have started when they were younger. That maybe they come into awareness of the communities a little later, and then maybe a little after that, they start actually participating in the communities. So I think all that makes a lot of sense. And then I also asked folks what cause or causes they attribute to their non-human identity. This was a check all that apply item that included spiritual, psychological, neurological, and other options. And you can see that spiritual, psychological, and neurological were all endorsed by over half of the participants. So these are all super, super common um, causes to attribute to one's identity. And I think the fact that they all had so many is really indicative of the fact that, for a lot of folks, it seems pretty common for people to have different causes they attribute for different like kin types or parts of their identity. So yeah, I just think this makes a lot of sense and is about what I would have expected. And then I did ask folks just very directly if they experience species dysphoria with options of yes, no, or not sure. And over 76% said yes. Um, and only a few said no or not sure. Oh my gosh. I keep trying to go to the next slide on my other computer because I'm sitting at like my desktop and my laptop at the same time. Um, Anyway, so getting into the results of the actual hypotheses and research aims I had. So with this first research aim, it ended up being to compare non-human and human identified trans and non-binary participants, while taking into account autistic identities on all these various labels. So remember, I had to drop the gender analysis part of this because there were too few cis and binary trans folks. And so this analysis ended up being limited to only the trans and non-binary participants. So first I compared this on depression, anxiety, and stress. And I essentially for all these, I predicted that the folks with the more minoritized identities, so the non-human and the autistic identities, would have worse mental health. That was kind of my across the board hypothesis, given again minority stress theory. So since folks with these minoritized identities are experiencing minority stressors, it makes sense that they would exhibit worse mental health than folks with dominant identities who are not experiencing those stressors. Um, the results didn't really pan out for that though. There were no differences between non-human and human participants on these variables, and there was no significant interaction between non-human and autistic identity. The only significant finding here was that autistic participants did score higher on anxiety specifically than non-autistic participants. And then I also did the same kind of comparison with camouflaging, as the outcome variable that I was looking at. Again, expecting non-human and autistic folks to score higher on camouflaging. But once again, there were actually no differences between non-human and human participants. There was no significant interaction. The only significant finding was that autistic folks did score higher than non-autistic folks. This really makes a lot of sense. The way I measured camouflaging was with the camouflaging autistic traits questionnaire, the CAT-Q. So it's kind of designed to be looking at that type of camouflaging anyway. It definitely would have been way more surprising if this finding wasn't there. Um, but yeah, I really did think that non-human folks would also demonstrate more camouflaging than human folks, given how common it is for people to talk about like masking their non-human identities and whatnot. So I found this pretty surprising actually. And then I also did the same kind of comparison with psychological well-being and prioritizing meaning, so the more positive mental health variables as the outcomes here. This one had no differences between non-human or human folks or autistic and non-autistic folks, but there was a significant interaction on the combined variables. So essentially what this means is that the association of one identity status, whether you're human or non-human, the relationship that that has with psychological well-being and prioritizing meaning is dependent on your other identity status, whether you're autistic or non-autistic. So basically, like a non-human autistic person, that trend with psychological well-being and prioritizing meaning is different than it is for non-human autistic or non-autistic people, whatever the opposite one of the first one I said was. So what does all this mean? So some kind of like implications here. Um, it's important to note that non-human identified folks did not actually endorse worse mental health outcomes than human identified folks, as I predicted that they would. I find this to be a super optimistic outcome. That trans and non-binary non-human mental health is similar to other trans non-binary mental health. And I do think that's an important framing to keep this in, that remember this was a sample of entirely trans non-binary folks, the majority of whom were autistic. So this is a group of people who do experience a lot of other minority stressors and who are known to have mental health disparities. I'm not saying our mental health is like great in the grand scheme of things necessarily, because there are still those factors to keep in mind, but it is really encouraging to me that our non-human identity itself and the stressors associated with that are not necessarily adding to the mental health challenges that we face, and it actually does look similar to other queer folks. Research aim 2 was to make the species dysphoria scale. So I did in fact make the scale. Here's an image of all the items. I made the items based on adaptations of some gender dysphoria related measures, as well as my own community observations, my own personal experiences in the community and with species dysphoria. Um, so it included items like I have felt I am missing physical attributes of my species identity. I have felt like my chest does not match my species identity. I have felt that the way my body looks naked does not represent my species identity. I have felt my body is the wrong shape for my species identity, etc. So just things trying to get at the experience of species dysphoria. Although a lot of them were pretty focused on body dysphoria. So this scale worked out. This slide is a little more technical than it probably needs to be for this panel. Again, this is ripped right from my dissertation defense, but Um, it had really high internal consistency. What that means is that it was in fact measuring a single variable, species dysphoria, that I hoped it was measuring. And alpha of 0.94 is actually really, really high. I was like over the moon when I saw that result. Um, all item to total correlations were significant. That means that the score on each individual item was significantly related to people's overall score, which is good because it shows that each individual item is related to what you're measuring overall. And then I also did an analysis to see if people's score on the species dysphoria scale would predict their answer to that categorical item where I asked, "Do you experience species dysphoria? Yes, no, or not sure." And the score did significantly predict those responses with an almost 91% correct accuracy of those predictions. So ultimately, this was a success. I was able to make the species dysphoria scale and include it in subsequent analyses. Also, just some other kind of implications of this. Um, This is the first continuous measure of species dysphoria that's ever been created, and the first time species dysphoria has ever been directly examined in an academic study, which I think is really cool. Like I said, I'm really interested in species dysphoria as a construct. I do think this is really important given the high rates of species dysphoria in our community, documented in so many community surveys and now also in this academic survey. Um, I'm able to then examine species dysphoria as a minority stressor, and I hope that future research can build upon this to further explore it more and more. So remember research aim 3 was testing this model to see if these stressors and resilience factors would predict psychological distress and psychological well-being. Here is the actual model of what I found. Um, so camouflaging in species dysphoria as minority stressors did significantly positively predict psychological distress. So that means the more camouflaging and the more species dysphoria folks had, the more depression, anxiety, and stress they had. They also significantly negatively predicted psychological well-being, meaning the more camouflaging and more species dysphoria folks had, the less psychological well-being they had. So taking those two things together, camouflaging and species dysphoria did in fact predict worse mental health, in both of the ways that I measured it for folks. um, which is what I predicted, so that was cool to see that pan out. Um, Prioritizing meaning and identity pride were only significantly related to psychological well-being, so they did not actually predict depression, anxiety, stress at all, but they did positively predict psychological well-being. So the more prioritizing meaning and identity pride folks reported, the more psychological well-being they reported. So these resilience factors are in fact related to better well-being. Um, which I expected and is cool. It was surprising that they weren't also negatively related to distress, though. And the thing that I just found so odd is that community connectedness did not end up being significantly related to either outcome variable. And this is really inconsistent with past research on both like the trans non-binary minority stress models, other qualitative research within our community. Um, I have a few different ideas of, like, why this might not have panned out, but this was, like, the really kinda weird part of this analysis. Um, so yeah, in terms of kinda, like, contextualizing these findings, it identified camouflaging and species dysphoria as minority stressors, which is consistent with research that's found that camouflaging and gender dysphoria are stressors related to poor mental health in trans and autistic samples. It identified identity pride and prioritizing meaning as resilience factors, which is also consistent with past research showing that those things are associated with positive mental health. Community connectedness did not predict either psychological distress or well-being, which is inconsistent with the qualitative results of this study, which we'll get to shortly, and other non-human identity studies. Okay, so the fourth research aim was the qualitative portion. Just as a reminder, these were the things that I asked folks about, and I'm gonna go through some general themes and just a handful of quotes about each. I'm really excited when the dissertation is actually up online for y'all to get to see that you'll be able to read more of the quotes. I was only able to fit a few in here for the sake of time. So in terms of the relationship between folks on human and gender identities, most people did report that non-human identity somehow influenced their gender identity. There was some kind of relationship there that people described. A lot of folks talked about a disconnect and a rejection of human gender roles and human social norms broadly, and that was a big piece of that relationship between these identities. A lot of folks just simply describe their gender as non-human, which I think we're all pretty familiar with that concept at this point, with so many other panels that have talked about that concept. And there was quite a bit of discussion of the overlap of species and gender dysphoria and euphoria. So, a couple of quotes related to this. One person said, "Species and gender identity are the same thing to me. My gender is unknowable and undefinable in relation to a human gender binary in the same way that an eldritch being is undefined by human norms. It simply doesn't apply to my eldritch form. It's like asking a raindrop about taxes." And another quote that says, "In a lot of ways, my gender and species identities overlap with one another. When I want to look masculine, I don't want to present as human masculine. I want to present as dragon masculine, which involves an entire different set of roles, body language, etc. When I experience dysphoria, it isn't just, oh, my chest shouldn't be like that, it should be flat. It's also, it should have scales or fur." In terms of the relationship between folks' non human and autistic identities, it was much more common for folks to attribute their non-human identity to their autism than the inverse. There were a handful of people who said, like, they believe that they meet the diagnostic criteria of autism or are autistic because they're non-human, but it was way more likely for people to do the opposite, to say that they think that being autistic has led them to develop, and create or end up identifying as non-human in some way. And so as part of that experience, folks talked about a lot of similarities between non-human and autistic experiences, including feeling othered, having difficulties with human social norms, stimming. Lots of folks talked about stimming in like animal or otherwise species affirming ways, sensory sensitivities, and difficulties with coordination and spatial awareness, that were attributed both to autism and like phantom limb experiences and different like body maps than the human body. So one quote kind of encapsulating a bunch of those pieces was one person who said, I feel that my identity as a non human and my autism are intertwined in some way. I know that either way, I've always felt ostracized from humanity and human interaction as a whole. Picking up on social cues and reading between the lines the way others seem to do so naturally has always been difficult at best. Whether the root of this is my non humanity, my autism, or both, I don't really know. All I can say is that it all plays a role. So I also like how this quote really highlights the way that the relationship between these identities is in a lot of ways just really inextricable. It can't really be pulled apart. There's so much overlap and they're both such an intrinsic part of who one is that it can be difficult to like attribute things to one or the other. And then in terms of asking about non-human identity related stressors, in terms of distal stressors, so again, those external stressors, these were the ones that folks reported, that were themes that I found, many of them mapping onto those previous models of minority stress and resilience I talked about earlier. So harassment and rejection both came up, as did negative social perception of non-human identity. So, just feeling like people at large have a negative view of non-human identity. Some folks talked about like the bathroom bills and the kitty litter box stuff and just some of the legislation going on right now and things like that. Um, Being referred to as human came up as a sort of analogous experience to being misgendered. But that pain or discomfort that's felt when someone's referred to as human. Um, I thought about trying to coin a word for this phenomenon in my paper and decided not to because I couldn't think of something that felt like it would work well. The only thing that comes to mind as a parallel to misgendered is like misspeciesed, which is like really hard to say and clunky. I do think as a community, we should name this phenomenon so that we can talk about it and so that I/others can talk about it in academia as well. And I think it's better to have a community created term than to have someone else come in and try to coin it. So I held off on coining it. We should all come together and coin it. Just wanted to throw that out there for everybody. Um, Other distal stressors included social difficulties, um, anthropocentrism, and intra-community issues, including um, gatekeeping and grilling and misanthropy and things like that within the communities. A couple quotes related to some of those stressors, having to confront people about it in person who wanted to use it to try to mock and belittle or even physically harm me is another stressor I've had in the past. So that fell under the harassment stressor. Another person said, mostly society having a negative view on non human identity. I believe life would be a lot easier if we could be open about what we are. And then finally, being less able to socialize properly is also a huge stressor. And I feel this is in part because the socialization that's built, for lack of a better word, into me is so different from how humans interact with each other. In terms of proximal stressors, so those internalized stressors, the most commonly endorsed one was species dysphoria. Um, which was interesting and again, I found cool because it was so common in both the quantitative side of the study as well as was the biggest proximal stressor that came up in the qualitative side of the study. Now, what I wasn't expecting and what I also thought was really, really cool was that folks described so many different aspects of their species dysphoria that I was able to actually break it into subcategories of dysphoria, which I termed bodily dysphoria for things related to like the body mismatch kind of experiences, emotional dysphoria to refer to the grief and longing aspects of dysphoria, social dysphoria to refer to the experiences of being perceived as human or being not perceived as one species and the dysphoria that that can create, and environmental dysphoria to highlight mismatches between one's current living environment and the habitat or realm or whatever kind of environment that one's, identity would live in and the kind of, like, homesickness kind of feelings that can come along with that. Then camouflaging also came up as a proximal stressor, so concealment of one's identity, needing to mask, one's non-human traits, that was a big one as well. Anticipated minority stress, is a way of, describing having, like, negative expectations about experiencing the distal stressors, so, like, fear of rejection, fear of experiencing harassment, things like that, that's often very intertwined with camouflaging, right? So you hide your identity because you're afraid of those negative experiences that might happen if you, were to disclose, and that in and of itself is an added stressor. Then there was also internalized negativity, so, like, internalizing the negative messages about non-human identity, thoughts like, "I'm too weird, I'm too much for this, people will think I'm crazy," self-doubt, things like that. And then exotrauma also came up with a handful of folks, enough that I did wanna highlight it in my study and, as far as I know, introduce this term in the psychological literature, which I just think is really important. I think it's such a valuable term and describes a really important experience that therapists and the field of psychology as a whole should be aware of, so I highlighted it here with that. Some quotes around these things. One person said, I would say that always feeling like I am in the wrong body is the largest stressor. This ranges and fluctuates from simple disconnect to outright distress. Wearing clothing that feels too tight can make me feel panicked and even more distressed about my body, like my skin doesn't fit right and things aren't how they should be. This feeling of a wrong body has caused instances of experiences where may feel that my limbs do not belong to me or don't look right. Another person shared not being able to tell anybody about my identity and having to suppress my identity at times and the dysphoria that can cause. So this person also highlighted the relationship between camouflaging or identity concealment and dysphoria that can come about. And then this last quote, I am putting on a performance and it feels degrading and exhausting to know that 99.9% of the people around me do not understand what I go through and would label me as crazy instantly. Then in terms of resilience factors, there are a few group level resilience factors that came up. So group level meaning there being like multiple people involved. And that included community connectedness, social support, and therapy were the ones that came up a lot for folks. Here's one quote about the community connectedness piece. Finding a community of those who can relate, both the plural and the non-human communities have provided a safe space where, for once, I'm not an outsider and outcast. No pressure for masking and trying to put up the facade of being human, being free from social constraints, respite from constant denial. There were also several individual level resilience factors that came up. People listed a ton of just like individual coping techniques like engaging in art, journaling, mindfulness, music, distraction, fantasy. Connecting to one's non-human identity was another really big one that included things like expressing one's identity outwardly, engaging with one's kin type through media or through like volunteering with the actual species, connecting with nature. As well as greater purpose. A lot of folks shared experiences of feeling like their identities give them a sort of higher purpose or just like sense of meaning and fulfillment in their life. Um, that kind of contributed to their well-being. So here's one quote about expressing one's identity. It's helpful to present in ways that represent my non-humanity. Even if I only do it when no one's around, it feels good to wear my little dragon horns that I made for myself to reflect who I truly am inside. And then I also asked about non-human identity related joy, and this was, I mean, just such a joy to read through. I like teared up when I read through everyone's responses on this. It was just so heartwarming. Some themes that came out of it included unique perspective. So a lot of people talked about the unique perspective they feel like they get from having this identity experience and living and navigating life in this way. Self-understanding, so people talking about the joy that they get from having such a deep understanding of themselves, through understanding their non-human identity. Authenticity, and species euphoria and identity pride were also really big pieces, so just finding a lot of joy in living as one's authentic self, in embracing one's non-human identity, and finding, just pockets of fun and joy in that. I just grabbed a few of the shorter quotes around that here. "I like feeling like myself. It makes me who I am. It means dragons are real, smiley face." I love that. I loved every time people included smiley faces in their answers. Um, and here's one quote that just kind of encapsulates a lot of those pieces of the joy component. Our last quote to end on. "I like that I'm a wolf inside. I'm strong, tenacious, loyal, kind, silly, playful, and beautiful. I may never know what it feels like to actually have the physical match the internal vision I have of myself, but that's okay. I can live with the paradox of being both wolf and human. I don't think I am special in the way that means I am better than other people, but I do think being a Therian is special. I have a very deep connection with my soul that I don't think the average person has. It's a very intimate understanding of who I am on the inside, and even though it doesn't match my outer body, and that used to cause me distress, I have grown to love that I have this secret inner knowing." Um, so kind of contextualizing these findings, this qualitative part of the study. Um, so these qualitative findings were largely consistent with the quantitative results and with minority stress theory. So like once again, species dysphoria and camouflaging were identified as stressors. These, along with social difficulties, are also consistent with past non-human research, including my previous thesis. Most participants did report a relationship between their non-human identity and their gender and autistic identities, and I think this is really important to highlight. Again, just like within the field of psychology and for mental health professionals, that it's just so important to take an intersectional approach to understanding non-human identified individuals' experiences of gender and autism. Okay, last section, just a few more implications of the study. Um, so one of the biggest takeaways I had from this that I want to advocate for within the psych field is just the need for regular assessment of non-human identity, both in research and mental health spaces. Non-human identity should be a standard demographic variable in research, especially with trans, non-binary, and autistic populations. Um, you might recall I pointed out how I ended up recruiting 11 non-human participants during my human recruitment phase. This, if nothing else, highlights that research is already including non-human identified participants, but this identity factor isn't being taken into account because it isn't being assessed. So we don't know all the ways that this could impact research that's already being done because we're simply not asking about it. And similarly to what I said on the previous slide, mental health professionals really need to be inquiring about non-human identities, similar to other cultural factors. Again, especially with trans, non-binary, and autistic clients, given the super high overlap of those three identities. Again, we need an intersectional approach to understanding these three identities and incorporating that understanding of our clients in therapy spaces. And while plurality itself wasn't like a specific focus of the study, I did ask about it um, for both the non-human and the human folks. And while there were way more non-human identified folks who identified as plural, there were also still a handful of human folks who did too. And so I really hope that the study provides evidence that plurality should also be regularly assessed in research and clinical settings. These are both identities that are real and they're important and they're not taken into account within the field of psychology the way they should be. And I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift of that, and I hope that this can help further that and get mental health professionals more aware of these things and talking about these things with their clients. In terms of some more specific clinical implications, mental health professionals working with non-human identified clients should assess for minority stressors, including camouflaging, species dysphoria, anticipated minority stress, and internalized negativity. Interventions targeting these stressors may reduce distress and improve well-being. Similarly, interventions aimed at increasing identity pride and prioritizing meaning may have positive benefits for well-being among non-human identified clients. Other resilience factors that came up in the qualitative part of the study, such as community connectedness and species euphoria, may also be bolstered to improve well-being. Um, so again, I hope that the study can help spread awareness about these topics so that mental health professionals can feel more equipped to work with non-human identified folks and know how to approach doing that. So, final conclusions. Non-human identified individuals do not appear to have worse mental health than other TMB populations. Yay. The minority stress framework is applicable to non-human identified populations. Mental health professionals and researchers should make a habit of assessing for non-human identity. Mental health professionals should assess for minority stress and resilience factors, including mitigating species dysphoria and bolstering identity pride. And future research should seek to validate particular interventions targeted at supporting non human identified folks' mental health, building off interventions for gender affirming mental health care. And that's why I think it's so important that the study was situated within the minority stress framework. Like, we already know how to work with minority stressors in therapy, like for trans folks and sexual minority folks. We just need to adapt that to working with non-human folks. And so that those are some of my next steps that I see in the research and that I would like to get to do moving forward. But like I said, I'd love to know what y'all think would be important next steps too. So that concludes the uh, presentation part of this. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen somehow, and I can start looking at questions. Oh, thanks, Kai, for dropping a link to my thesis earlier. Okay, wait, I thought compensation for participation in a study was potentially unethical. Like, been over a decade since my classes on that. Could you go over a bit deeper why compensation was needed? Yeah, good question. Um, so you have to be mindful when considering your compensation in studies. It is not inherently unethical to compensate folks. You just have to make sure that the compensation you're offering isn't so high that it would be coercive to like that people would feel like they had to participate to get the compensation or reward. So I paid people, like I said, $10, which is a low enough amount of money that even amongst like folks who are lower income, that isn't considered a coercive amount. And again, like this went through my school's institutional review board, the ethics committee that um, approved this study. Um, Compensation wasn't technically needed, but, like, my research advisor feels really strongly about compensating folks in, her research with queer people, and I honestly just felt similarly with this study. Like, I love that our community is so science-minded that we participate in each other's, like, community surveys all the time, and, like, I've had folks participate in my past research before, but I just felt like for my dissertation, given the scope of it and everything, I wanted to be able to do something a little bit more, and to be able to really, like, respect my participants' time by offering that compensation. So that's why I compensated people. It wasn't unethical. It was approved by the ethics committee, etc. When this panel is put on YouTube, do you think it would be useful to send to mental health professionals? I do. I kept that in mind as I was framing the panel. That is, again, partly why I kept some slides worded the way I did from my dissertation defense. I really hope this can be a resource not only for us, but also for furthering this information within the mental health field. Um, I'm also really, really, really planning on making a professional website very soon now that I'm like actually finally finishing my PhD program. And what I want to do with that website is to be able to offer trainings and consultations for mental health professionals working with alter human folks, and neurodivergent and trans folks, um, as well as just like share like educational resources and things like that. So I hope that's another resource I'll be able to have up soon-ish. I don't know exactly when it'll be, to be honest, but I just want to throw it out there. I do think it's important to be getting more and more resources out there for mental health professionals. I hope this panel can be part of that, and I'm planning on trying to build uh, the accessibility of resources like that. Okay, got a long one here. Okay, so this person was asking about the relationship between autism and being non-human being so intertwined. Conceptually, it makes sense why plurality is more common in our community, since animal alters are not uncommon and acknowledged by mental health professionals, but autism in particular making people feel less than human or not human is very interesting. I see it online all the time, even in spaces that aren't non-human related. Of course, there is a caveat that comes with community statistics. We only hear from autistic people who are online enough to discover and interact with non-human communities, so this potential survivorship bias makes me wonder if this phenomenon is specific to autistic people who are also fairly online like me, or if it correlates with autism on some deeper level in the general population. What are your thoughts on this? Yeah, it's a super good question. I think anytime we're doing online research, we have to acknowledge that like we're only going to be accessing people who are online enough to find out about the research. Um, I do think it is probably likely that autistic people on the whole are more likely to be non-human, just like autistic people on the whole are more likely to be trans, and non-binary and otherwise queer. And there's still a lot of speculation as to why that is, but there's some research, um, kind of like exploring the possibility that like because autistic brains are not wired towards, like, social norms, like, we reject so many social norms anyway, that we're less likely to be so ingrained in things like cisnormativity, heteronormativity, and just, like, accept that as a given that it kind of, like, opens us up to being open to exploring our identities more and thus arriving at like a queer identity or a trans identity. And I think something really similar could very easily be happening with non-human identity too, where we're less likely to just take it as a given that we're human, and the concept of like the social construct of human, maybe we just buy into less and are more like open to questioning and thus might arrive at a non-human identity. Um so yeah, I think it's important to yeah, have that caveat that like our sample is limited to folks who are online, and I think just thinking about the way that neurodivergent brains work, it kind of makes sense um that autistic people might just be more likely to identify as non-human in general. Is there any way the SDS can be published as an online self-test? I want to share it with some people who'd be really interested and also take it myself out of pure idle curiosity. Um, it is not currently. I need to my goal is to do like actual academic publications out of the results of this dissertation, and when um uh and that one of those will be about the creation of the SDS and then it will be available. Um In the meantime, like, I'm potentially open to just sharing the survey items with y'all, and I mean, you can literally see it in the panel. I included the response scale too, which just like a strongly disagree to strongly agree kind of thing. Oh, well, actually, yeah, gosh, silly me. The whole thing will be in the actual dissertation once that's online too. So yeah, within probably a few weeks or so, I'm hoping that I'm able to get the dissertation up, maybe a couple months tops. Yes, that will be accessible. Okay, yeah, people were asking about the numbers in the sum graphic. Sorry, I just kind of breezed over those. Those are beta values, so the standardized um predictor values. So not R squared, but beta values. So they go from 0 to 1, higher being a stronger relationship. There definitely needs to be more research regarding community connectedness and the other variables, but I think it would be interesting to look at attitude towards humanity as well as species specific characteristics. Are the species solitary or social? What do the pairings look like, etc.? That's such a good point. I really appreciate you bringing that up. I hadn't even actually really considered that. It makes sense that people's own species identities might impact their, like, interest in, like, engaging in community connection. So yeah, that's a really cool point that you just brought up. Thank you. As a question to follow up on the chat discussion, have the non-binary and queer community connection research distinguished between online and in-person spaces? Honestly, not really, and not very well. And actually, yeah, to comment on the community connectedness piece more, one of the things that I speculate about why I didn't find a significant finding there is that I just adapted the existing um gender minorities stress and resilience models community connectedness scale for this study. So basically I just replaced anything that said like gender identity with species identity and like community. Um and so I think maybe that was just not the best way of assessing what community connectedness actually looks like in our community, that there might be unique aspects of the way that our community gets together and the way that folks connect with it. Um, that would just benefit from making a whole new measure, to actually look at that more specifically, and that's something that, I might do in the future. Is it normal to identify as non-human, but at the same time not completely, as if it's a constant species flux that never reaches an ending point from one or the other direction? Um, the concept of normal is a lie, and you can do whatever you want forever, as we've been saying, all weekend this con. If that's your experience, and you are valid in it. Okay, yeah, other people have been saying it's pretty normal. Um, I'm curious about how the study categorizes people who identify as both human and non-human. Yeah, so since I just asked people, do you identify as, and then I basically listed like every non-human identity term I could think of, or another non-human identity, and people who put yes were categorized as non-human. I didn't actually ask non-human folks if they also identified as human. So I think that could be another really important, interesting piece to incorporate into future research to see if there's like any differences between folks who identify solely as non-human versus both human and non-human. Let's see. A question I have is if you've seen anyone uncomfortable interacting with the community, how you might give advice to those struggling with that. For example, I'm a dragon, feel a bit uncomfortable interacting with other dragons or with the Dragon King community, and if this would be a topic you might look into in the future. Um, yeah, I'm honestly not super sure, but I think, going up to um ISO's point above that, like thinking about how people's identities might impact the way they like interact with the community would be really important and interesting to take into consideration and look into in the future. Do you think that the sense of greater purpose associated with non-humanity might contribute to there being no significant difference in mental health well-being versus humans? Possibly. Yeah, that the greater sense of purpose, which I think is tied to that prioritizing meaning variable I included, I think could very well be related, and that might be like a stronger resilience factor for us that could kind of cancel out that effect. Yeah, I think that's totally possible. Out of curiosity, how many participants identified as anthropomorphic animals? I don't remember off the top of my head, and people didn't necessarily always specify that, but like there were some folks who differentiated like identifying as like a werewolf versus a wolf and things like that. Like I mentioned earlier, there is a little bit more detail of folks reported kin types in the actual dissertation paper. That I will again, I that will be out hopefully pretty soon, and I am gonna be posting that on, like, every forum I recruited from, every Discord server I recruited from, and I'll probably post on Tumblr, so that will be out and easily available, um, hopefully pretty soon. How did you differentiate the operationalized attributional constructs for non-humanity psychological and neurological attribution? Um, I believe I gave examples for each of those. Under psychological, I put, like, imprinting trauma, etcetera, and for neurological, I put, like, neurodivergence, um, or some other kind of, like, neurological wiring thing. etc. But it was really up to participants to kind of like interpret that and decide how they like self-categorize in that regard. Um, oh, yes. Whenever ready, you'd like to ask your question out loud. Go for it. Small paw. I don't hear you if you're saying anything. I did not hear you. Okay. Um, I'm gonna keep going for now, but like feel free to try to chime in. Um, let's see. I have a question. It's been nagging me for a while. Is there a term for when a person once identified as human, but through trauma that they become non-human? I'm asking since this happened to me. I've been so much happier because of this. Um, I mean, I think some people might well, I guess it kinda depends. If it was, like, a consciously chosen identity, like, some people might use, like, other link or coping link for that. I think you could just call yourself otherkin or therian or fictionkin or, what non-human, like, whatever term applies to you. The terms are really kinda less about what causes it and more just about what the identity experience is. And as we saw, like, people attribute all kinds of different things, to their identities. So, that would just be one example of, a trauma explanation or a psychological explanation. Um, Mind-blowing work. This needs to be repeated in Europe. What do we need for that? Someone in Europe who wants to do it, or like I said, my kind of top priority, I would say, with future research is to make sure I can recruit worldwide, and replicate this in a larger thing. Um, how common is it to find non-humans in a psychiatric or psychological profession as clients out in the wild? Is it something that's seen more frequently than you'd think, or is it hard to find? I've worked with a handful of human clients, mostly plural systems. Um, I think what's really tricky about it is that like therapists don't ask about that, and I think that's a problem, like I was saying. And clients aren't necessarily going to bring it up because they're going to assume that therapists don't know about it. And there's, that fear of rejection and being misunderstood and invalidated. Um, so I think it probably is more common than like therapists are aware of it because it is probably just not coming up with a lot of folks who don't feel comfortable bringing it up and whose therapists don't bring it up. It's definitely something that I try to look out for with my clients and bring up when it seems relevant, to be like affirming and to create a safe space for folks to talk about those things. I know we've got a couple other psych folks in the field who are trying to do that work too, but it is just like a really kind of new and growing thing currently. I really wish I had known about this when you're looking for participants. How do I find slash make myself known to other people doing studies like this? I'm trying to get more involved in the community again. I'd love to contribute like that. I think just being around in the community, like I said, I recruited from forums and Discord groups. I also like made a post on Tumblr, directing people to the forum threads. Um, I feel like, I see a lot of folks post their community surveys on forums and on Tumblr and other social media and stuff. So, I think just being around and keeping your ear out for these kinds of things can help you hear about them. Um, yes, with the compensation piece with US and Canada, if it would have been better to waive it for additional participants. Yes, like I said, in the future, I'm going to approach things a little bit differently, but I was glad to get to pay people and do the study like this for this time. About the website for mental health, would it be possible for it to be international? We had a fear of visiting a mental health professional being plural. I mean, the website I'm planning on making will just be like resources that anyone can use and access. Um, in terms of like consulting with other therapists in other countries, I don't know off the top of my head the ethics of that. I don't think there would be a problem with it because it's not doing actual clinical work. But that's something I'd have to look into and make sure I was, abiding by all laws and ethical regulations with that. Is there any way we can go to see any resources you do in the future since the website doesn't exist yet? Is there somewhere I could head to see when it does? Yeah, I'm gonna share that on forums, in Discord servers, on Tumblr. Again, like all the different places. I'm gonna try to make that as known as possible. Like, part of me had wanted to try to make it before this con to be able to advertise it before this con, but I've had some shit come up this summer that slowed some things down. um, so yeah, it's still a work in progress, but it is something I'm going to make as widely shared as possible. I missed the beginning, so I apologize if this was addressed. Will this be published as my thesis? Yes, the dissertation should be uploaded to ProQuest in weeks or months, but like not long. It should be soon, and I will spread the word when it is, so that y'all can have access to it. Um, Could you please contextualize how strong those relationships are within your field? 0.32 seems high, 0.25 seems high, never mind 0.55, but I'm not sure what the values would be considered typical. Yeah, that's a really good question. I apologize for not contextualizing that. I really was on the fence about how in depth to go with like the stats shit because I didn't want it to feel like overwhelming to people who aren't familiar. Um, those are considered like moderate to high. Um, Above, like, point 0.3 is usually considered, like, moderate to high, so, yeah, those are pretty, well, they're statistically significant, but in terms of, like, they are meaningful, like, significant in a meaningful sense, kind of, values. What kind of software analyses did you use? I used M plus for the structural equations modeling, and I just used SPSS for the other stuff. I'm also proficient in R, but my research advisor only uses SPSS, so that's what I used for the rest of it. Because that was her preference. But yeah, in general, like I do recommend R since it's free and easy to download a lot of different things for it and learn about it. If we want to know when the dissertation is released, is there somewhere we can follow you? You can follow me on Tumblr. My Tumblr is xbloodmuffinsx.tumblr.com. Um, or again, like at various forums and Discord groups. Like I'll definitely post about it, like in the other Connect server, for example. So if y'all, are over there, you'll get a ping about it. Another question, would you predict a correlation between misanthropy and psychological distress in the ultrahuman community? Probably, because I think if you're holding misanthropic views, that might contribute to some like rejection, like anticipated rejection, or um you might also hold the misanthropic views because of negative experiences you've had with humans, like those distal stressors, which could also contribute. So I definitely think those things could all be related. Um, the exact causality of that, I'm not sure, but I could see it going in a couple different directions, like I just said. And yeah, I think it's possible that there could be a relationship there. Okay, their question was already answered. What if you included questions about how neurodiverse folks feel about diagnoses? I feel potential stigma around them. Often being worded as disease could bring some weirdness. Um, yeah, I mean, I totally feel you there. I'm very in favor of like the neurodiversity movement and non stigmatizing things. Yeah, I could do a whole panel on how much I hate the DSM. But yeah, I think future research could take those kinds of things into account as well. Um, if you do any future surveys, how do we find them? Would love to participate. Again, all the places I've been mentioning so far are likely where I would be for those things. Any plans on adding zoanthropes and clinical lycanthropy in a following study? Honestly, yeah, I would like to explore that more as well. Already, like folks who identify in that way were welcome to participate in the study if they identified as non-human. Again, that was the only criteria. The specific label wasn't important to me. I was interested in just getting folks who self-identified as non-human, regardless of like attribution or cause or voluntary, involuntary, any of that kind of stuff was irrelevant for the sake of like who I was recruiting for this. Um so like already folks could have participated if they identified in that way. I'm trying to think. I don't recall if anyone said they did identify as such, but I do include all the write-in options for other in the actual dissertation document, so you'd be able to see there when it's up if anyone did. But yeah, the kind of like the relationship between clinical lycanthropy and therianthropy, otherkinity, is something I'm generally like interested in, and I think would be an important direction to go in future research, especially around like destigmatizing those experiences. I Oh, I'm trying to rein in my brain. Again, I could go on a whole rant about the DSM and how it pathologizes things and how it treats people with psychosis and all kinds of things that um is really terrible, but I would love to help kind of shift the narrative in a more affirming way in the future. Where do you recruit from? I'm not quite connected to the Otherkin community. I feel like I might have a small bit of data you're looking for in future projects. Again, forums like the Wireless, Non-Human National Park, various Discord servers. I did recruit from Other Connect, for example. Um, yes, I can post a link to my Tumblr. That should do it. Or I guess that doesn't have a link function though. One sec. There you go. Already I've caught up with the questions. And I see I ran wow, just a few minutes over time. I'm honestly kind of surprised. Any other last questions? Before you go, you mentioned a spreadsheet. Will that ever be shared? That specific spreadsheet that I use to analyze my qualitative data will not be shared, but the results from it that are a little more detailed than I shared in the presentation are included in the written dissertation document. The dissertation is over 170 pages. There's a lot more in it than what I was able to cover today. Aw, thanks, y'all. I really appreciate all of you so fucking much for participating, for being here, for all your support. I've been so excited to get to share this with you all. Like I cared more about doing this than I did about, like defending the dissertation because y'all are who I'm doing it for. So thank you so much for being here. Um, yeah, I will wrap it up here. Thanks, y'all.